So what's the real difference between being an atheist and being agnostic? It's a question that comes up a lot in conversations, debates, and especially online arguments where everyone seems determined to define each term as if there's only one correct answer. But the truth is more subtle than most people realize. And maybe that's the whole point. Labels like these are meant to simplify things, to give us neat categories to put ourselves and each other's into. But when it comes to belief, or the lack of it, things aren't always that clean. Some people think atheists claim to know there's no God, while agnostics are just unsure. Others see atheists as combative and agnostics as more diplomatic. But is that actually accurate? Or is it a misunderstanding built on years of confusion and misuse? Let's start with something basic but often overlooked. Belief and knowledge are not the same thing. Belief is about what you accept as true. Knowledge is about what you think you can know for sure. So when someone says they're an atheist, they're saying they don't believe in a God or gods. They're not necessarily saying they know for a fact that no God exists. They're saying there's not enough evidence to convince them to believe in one. That's it. And when someone says they're agnostic, they're not necessarily saying they do believe or don't believe. They're talking about whether or not they think the question can be answered at all. It's possible to be both. In fact, many people are. You can be an agnostic atheist, someone who doesn't believe in any God but also doesn't claim to know for certain that no God exists. That's probably the most common position among secular people. You can also be an agnostic theist, someone who does believe in a God but admits they can't prove it. The words aren't opposites, they're talking about different things. Belief is one axis, knowledge is another. But here's where it gets messy. Over the years, these terms have been used interchangeably, sometimes on purpose, sometimes out of ignorance. In popular media, atheists are often portrayed as cold, cynical, or arrogant. Agnostics, on the other hand, get framed as open-minded, thoughtful, and humble. But those are caricatures. Whether someone is kind or hostile has nothing to do with the label they choose. It has everything to do with how they think, how they were raised, what they've experienced, and how willing they are to question their assumptions. Some of the most aggressive defenders of religion are technically agnostics, and some of the most thoughtful critics of it are atheists who rarely use the label. So why does the distinction matter at all? Because clarity matters. If someone says they're agnostic but they act as though belief in God is still probably true, they're not being neutral. They're leaning one way, even if they don't want to say it out loud. And if someone says they're an atheist but then gets caught up in trying to prove a negative, they're playing a game they can't win. You don't have to prove a God doesn't exist to reject the belief in one. You just have to recognize that no compelling evidence has been shown for one. That's it. No one spends time proving the non-existence of unicorns. We just don't believe in them until there's a reason to. Same with gods. But here's the deeper issue. Religion, in many cultures, still holds a sacred spot in public life. So when someone says, "I'm an atheist," it carries a certain weight. It suggests rejection, not just of gods, but of the authority that claims to speak on their behalf. And that makes people uncomfortable. Some lean on the term agnostic, not because they're confused about what they believe, but because it feels safer, less confrontational. But let's be honest. Is choosing a softer label really about accuracy? Or is it about social consequences? Most people aren't confused about what they believe. They're cautious about saying it out loud. Especially when the dominant culture equates disbelief with immorality, arrogance, or emptiness. But not believing in gods doesn't make you empty. It doesn't mean you've given up on meaning or purpose. It just means you're not buying into the stories offered by religion. And recognizing that you don't know something doesn't mean you're trapped in uncertainty forever. It just means you're being honest about your limits. In science, in philosophy, and in daily life, admitting what you don't know is the beginning of honest thinking. That's where agnosticism should live, not as a vague middle ground, but as a reminder that knowledge isn't absolute and belief should be earned, not assumed. So if someone says they're an agnostic, it's worth asking, do you believe in a God or not? If the answer is no, then they're functionally an atheist. Even if they don't like the word, the real difference isn't about certainty. It's about where the burden of proof belongs. Religious belief starts with an answer, then works backward. It tells you what to believe, how to behave, and what to fear. But a rational mind doesn't do that. It starts with questions. It examines claims. It demands evidence. And until that evidence is there, it withholds belief. That's not arrogance. That's discipline. Now let's talk about how these terms show up in everyday life. When politicians say they're not religious but spiritual, they're usually trying to avoid the label atheist. Not because they believe in a specific God, but because they know what happens when they reject the popular narrative. They get labeled as untrustworthy or out of touch with values. Same goes for public figures, celebrities, and even scientists. There's still a cultural penalty for saying you don't believe. So instead, people hedge. They call themselves agnostic, or open-minded, or seeking. It's not always about belief. It's often about fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of offending others. Fear of being seen as hollow, when in fact, rejecting unproven beliefs can be one of the most thoughtful and honest positions a person can take. But that honesty comes with a cost. It's easier to say, I'm agnostic, and leave it at that. It avoids confrontation. It lets people project whatever they want onto you, but it also leaves room for confusion. If you don't believe in any gods, if you live your life without appealing to divine authority, if you make decisions based on reason, empathy, and evidence, then you are, by definition, living as an atheist. And there's nothing wrong with owning that. Because belief should never be a placeholder for truth, and uncertainty isn't weakness. It's a mark of intellectual honesty. In the end, whether someone calls themselves atheist or agnostic is less important than how they think. Do they question? Do they seek evidence? Do they let go of beliefs that don't hold up under scrutiny? That's what matters. The rest is just terminology. And sometimes, the labels we're afraid to use say more about our environment than about our beliefs. So if you've been wrestling with what to call yourself, or avoiding the label that fits you best, maybe the real question isn't what you believe. Maybe it's whether you're willing to say it out loud. Because sometimes, clarity is the most courageous thing you can choose.